Okay, today we are going to talk a little bit about jQuery. What is jQuery? jQuery is a library that is used to augment JavaScript. What that means is someone created, or a group of people created, a set of functions that you can use in your JavaScript that hopefully makes your life easier. And I posted to Canvas jQuery tutorial that you should spend some time looking through over the next week. And here is an example of a jQuery function. They typically begin with a $sign. So what this is saying is create a function when the document is ready, or have a function when the document is ready to create a function on paragraphs that when you click the paragraph, it hides the paragraph. So what that looks like is this. Click on that, disappears, disappears, disappears. All right. So look at how we would do that in JavaScript. We did something very similar to that. And if you recall, it was a lot more code than this. All right. You can select based on several things in jQuery. In addition to, most of the time we've been selecting by ID. You can select by tag, you can select by the CSS query values, for example, so you can select by a class. Maybe I only want certain paragraphs to disappear. So I'll put a class on this paragraph saying changeable. Then I'll say for every paragraph of the class changeable. And those two don't disappear where that one does. All right, so you can select by things other than an ID, which you could do in JavaScript, but it was more involved. And they give more and more examples. Well, you should spend some time reviewing this, the basic tutorial and some of the effects that we have. Now, that is relevant because what we're going to do for the next assignment is take this real-time weather application, which is on this website, which is listed in Canvas, and we're going to add some functionality to it. But before we add the functionality to it, we have to understand exactly what that code does. So I downloaded the code. It's in this folder. And let's take a look at it. First of all, you'll notice as soon as you load the page, the web page wants to know our location. That is something that JavaScript cannot automatically do. JavaScript has to receive your permission to get and process your location. So, if I say allow, it will allow it, and it will say what the current temperature is, description of what the weather is, clear sky. It displays the proper icon, which is a little sun because it is sunny outside, and it says we are in Sheffield, USA. If you click on that, it switches to Fahrenheit, so we can go back and forth. This happens in JavaScript because we notice we're not reloading the page or anything. This is all happening via client-side code. All right. So what we're going to do initially to start off is to look at the code and make sure we understand it, and then we will go and look at what you need to do for the assignment. So let's close some of these windows down. Throughout this, I'm likely to say that, put the JavaScript equivalent of jQuery. As I mentioned before, I think I mentioned before, you can't do anything in jQuery that you can't do in JavaScript. Because you're basically writing JavaScript, you're just using some predefined functions in your JavaScript to make your life easier. So let's bring this guy up. And the script is at the bottom of the page. That's something I've noticed people do. If you remember in class, I talked about having a window on load event to make sure that the page is already loaded before you start doing any JavaScript on it. An alternative to that is putting it at the very bottom of the page, your script. And in that way, it's not going to hit this code until the page is already loaded. So that's another way that you can do this. This uses an external script file, which we talked about, but I don't think we showed any examples of. Here's an example. Script source equals, we have the name of the file, then our end script tag. I can edit that, and we'll take a look at it. First thing this does is it creates some variables that are going to be used throughout this entire JavaScript. Actually, let's back up a second. Let's look at the HTML. The HTML Actually, I stand corrected. This is not using jQuery. My mistake. Well, it does well, no, it doesn't use jQuery. My mistake. Thought for sure it did. All right, forget what I said about well, don't forget what I said about jQuery. It's just not relevant in this example. All right, the first thing we do is you notice that we define these variables, and we define them outside of any function. All right. If you define a variable outside of any function, you can use it anywhere within the script tag. So, icon element, we're using document query selector weather icon. Dot weather icon is a class. So what this is going to do is this is going to select the thing on the page that has a class of weather icon. If we look at that, that is this div right here. We find a place on the page that the temperature is going to be displayed, the description, again, a class of temperature value, and a paragraph. Paragraph within temperature value. So it's picking this paragraph right here. Temperature description, the paragraph in here. and location here. So when this is finished loading, when this is finished executing, these variables are set and they're pointing to the right spot on the page to change. That we're going to change from the values that we get in JavaScript. All right. Now, if I were writing this, I would have done it differently. I would have given each of these things an ID and used getElementById. Because with a class, it is possible on the page that you could have two things on the page with a class of weather icon. And if you did that, that would sort of mess up this whole code. So I would prefer not to use the class as a selector, but I would use getElementById. Document.querySelector is simply another way to select items on the page. Over here, we create a constant, a variable called weather. All right. And notice that we have the curly brackets over here. What this is doing effectively is this is creating a JavaScript object that we're going to use. Normally, a variable points to just one thing. We are going to create sort of a structure that is our weather object that's going to contain a bunch of different values, and each of those values is going to have a name. And you're going to refer to that name through dot notation. So for example, here, if we wanted to set the value, here we define that in the weather object, there is an attribute called temperature. And that temperature attribute contains itself a unit attribute of Celsius. So if I wanted to refer to that in my code, I would say weather.temperature.unit. And in fact, we do that down here. If weather temperature unit equals Celsius, we do this. Right? If weather, and then there's an else if it was set to Fahrenheit. So this allows us to have a complex data structure. Instead of a variable that has just one value or even an array which has multiple values, this allows us to have multiple different kinds of data that we're storing about this. So we're storing a temperature attribute that has a unit attribute associated with it. We define a couple other things. We define constant for Kelvin. Kelvin is another way of another temperature scale. With Kelvin, zero is absolute zero, the point at which all molecular motion stops, which is negative 273 degrees Kelvin. So 273, how does that work? You take the Celsius and you add the centigrade. You take the centigrade and add this 273 to it, and you get the temperature in Kelvin. Next thing we do is we define an API key. What we're going to do in this example is we're going to use what's called an API. Well, what is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interfaces. It's a way to enable two software components to communicate with each other using a set of definitions and protocols. For example, the Weather Bureau software system contains daily weather data. The weather app on your phone talks to the system via API and shows you your weather updates on your phone. That's essentially what we're doing in this example. The two pieces of software that are communicating are our web page and a weather service that keeps track of the weather around. Now, in order to use that service, you have to identify yourself, and that's typically done with an API key. So we set the API key here so that we can use it in any of our queries. When we call the API, we need to supply that so it knows that we're an authorized user. All right, next thing it does is it does this test to see if there's a geolocation in Navigator. It's looking to see if this property exists on the web page. Now, why would this not exist? One reason it might not exist is because we're running with an ancient browser. Running with an ancient web browser. Another reason it might not exist is because we have not given permission to allow the use of our location. And in those two cases, it's going to display a message on the page that says browser doesn't support geolocation. Let me try running this, refresh. If I say block, I've denied my web page access to the location, and it comes up with a message. Actually, it comes up with a message saying user denied geolocation. So I misspoke again. This if statement is only encountered if this is a very old browser. So there's two reasons why we can't get our location. One is the browser doesn't support it, or two, we've denied permission. Denied permission comes in with this statement here. Here we're asking the web browser to get the current position of the browser. Now, depending on your connection to the internet, this could be the location of your internet service provider. If you have GPS enabled, like for example, if you're viewing this on a mobile device and GPS was enabled, it would actually use your GPS to get your location. So it could give you a very accurate location. Otherwise, it would be the location of your cell tower if you're not using GPS. So it gets a little complicated. Just know that this may or may not be completely accurate. Might not pinpoint your exact location. When I teach the mobile web programming class, we actually do things where we use a GPS enabled, and we actually get very accurate. I've done projects where I could hold the web page on my phone and walk around campus, and I can see the pointer moving, indicating that I've walked around campus. Because the computer I'm using doesn't have GPS, this is the location of our, it's getting a location from our IP address, which would be a function of the internet service provider. Now here's where it comes in. If I deny permission, show error runs. If I can get the position, set position is called. Notice all this code is outside of any function, which means it will run as soon as a page is loaded. As soon as the browser hits these lines of code, it's getting it. And provided it's not a very old browser, it's going to try to get the position, and it either succeeds or fails. If it succeeds, it's going to call set position. If it fails, it's going to go to show error. Let's look to see what happens when it fails. When it fails, it calls show error. And what that does is that it gets called and passed an error message, and we set the style of our notification element for block, and we set the inner HTML to a paragraph that contains our error message. This syntax puts the value of this variable error.message right in the middle of this paragraph. So that's if I denied it. It displays that error message and sets notification style to display. Originally, it's probably set to, it sets it to block. Originally, it's probably set to being a display of none. Now, what if it succeeds? If it succeeds, it's going to call set position. And what we're going to do is we're going to use position returned, the latitude and longitude returned by the browser as far as what its current location is, to call the weather service and determine that. So if it succeeds, we're getting the latitude from the DOM. All right. In other words, if this statement succeeds, this variable is set with the current latitude, and this variable is set with the current longitude. So we store those in variables, and then we call our get weather function. So our get weather function calls. Now, what does this get weather function do? It's going to define our API call. And our API call is simply an address on the web, simply a URL. And we can test to see do this. Let's write to the console that API variable. I encourage you to use the console log to write things to there. To the console in terms of debugging. I'm going to copy the URL that it's calling, and it is calling this URL here. All right. What is that URL comprised of? It is comprised of the address of this organization and the address of its weather API. Version 2.5 of its API. We're passing it the latitude that we got from getting the position and the longitude, and we're passing in the app ID key to make sure that we're a legit user for this. So when we go and make the call, this is what we're getting. All right, this is what is called JSON data, JSON. And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So let's dissect this a little bit further. Let's open this up. We're going to put that in a variable. What's the name of the variable? Data. So how are we going to refer to things here? We're going to refer to things here this way. Since we're putting in a variable called data, if I wanted to get back the weather description, I would say data, because that's the variable I put this in, dot weather dot, this square bracket means an array. So we will say weather sub-zero. In other words, the first item in this list, we want a main variable. Okay? We're using that dot notation. The one thing that's tricky about this is this weather response is actually an array. There could potentially be multiple things in it. I'm not exactly sure when there would be multiple entries in there, multiple array elements, but there could be. And we want the first one, so we want sub-zero, and we want the main value. If we want the description, we would say data dot weather zero dot description. And we would pick out clear sky. Notice how this is written. We have the name of a variable, a colon, and the value. And in this case, for example, coordinates actually has two values associated with it, the longitude and latitude separated by commas. All right. So we define our API call. This is going to call the weather service and ask for some data. I outputted it to the log, and I tell the API to, I tell the browser to fetch this API. And fetch is going to look this way. Fetch is first going to, if it succeeds, it is going to call this function, which is going to return the data value. It's going to return this giant string of data. Then this function gets called on line 55, and it gets called and it gets passed that data that was returned by fetch of the API. And you see we set different variables in our JavaScript object. Remember up here we defined our JavaScript object as weather. And we said that weather has a temperature unit. Here we're setting some other properties. We're setting the weather temperature value. So if we were going to look at that weather data using JSON notation, it would look like this. Value. Whatever the temperature would happen to be in centigrade. I think it's currently 2 degrees centigrade. So that's what our JSON notation would look like if we're going to write out the JSON notation for this weather object. We're simply filling in these variables in that object. Where are we getting it from? We're getting it from data main temp. So where is that? In data. In main temperature. And the temperature is a whopping 275 degrees outside. Well, that seems like it's pretty hot, but remember that's in Kelvin. Kelvin is used by scientific applications typically because it has an absolute zero. There's no negative Kelvin temperatures. We take that and subtract 273 from it, and we get the temperature in centigrade. We pull from weather sub-zero the icon. And the icon is this is 01D. And we pull the city and the country from weather city and weather country. All right. So when we're done here, we got this weather object filled in with the temperature, the units and the values, the description, the icon ID, the city and the country. Now we're going to go and display the data. So it's a step process. Retrieve the data. Once we've retrieved the data, then we're going to grab the response from our fetch and store that JSON data in a variable called data. When that works, we're going to pass that data JSON object to this function, which is going to pull values out of it and put it in our JavaScript object. Once we've done that, then we're going to display the weather. And this weather is going to go and it's going to take that icon element and it's going to create an image based on the weather icon ID. So if you look out here in icons, 01D is the sunny icon. So depending on what icon gets returned, it uses that as part of the file name, .png. This is a neat little trick here where you take the quotes and you use the $sign to say, give me this JavaScript variable plopped right here in the middle of that HTML tag. We then grab from our weather object the temperature value and put it there, the description and put it there, and the city and country and put it in the location. All right, we're almost done. We have another piece of code that is outside of any function. I would actually add it up here. I would actually make all of this code outside a function in a Windows on load event, by the way, but again, they do things a little different. We're adding to this temperature element a click listener that allows us that if the weather unit is Celsius, we're going to convert the Celsius to Fahrenheit and display Fahrenheit. Otherwise, if it is Fahrenheit, we're going to convert it to, or we're going to just take the value from our weather object. So our weather object always contains Celsius, but we can change that display to be the Fahrenheit version of it. I would strongly suggest that you, in addition to listening to this lecture, watch this video.
Build your online business? Go to Wix.com and set up your Google Explain says hi. We're going to create a app using JavaScript.
This is a nice video. It's about 37 minutes long, and it gives an explanation. So if my explanation wasn't very clear, if there's some things you don't know about, sometimes it's useful to see another explanation. So watch this video if you're having any trouble at all understanding what you need to do and how this weather application works. All right. The other thing I provided you is a link to the actual API. And that'll show you how to call it. This should look familiar because that's exactly what we did. We called open weather map, data 2.5 weather, passed the latitude and longitude in our application ID. There's some optional things that you can add to it, units and so on, including a language. So if you wanted to write a Spanish version of this, you could change it to pass a language code of Spanish to this. And then the response is going to be in JSON format, and here is an example of it. So we have where we stored it, in our case, the variable data, .coord, .long, .land, data.weather, .id, .main, .description, .icon. weather or data.base stations. Weather.main, temp feels like high and low. These are important because I believe I've asked you to include these in the lab assignment that you need to do, and so on. So this shows you more details of what you get back, of how to make the call and what to get back. That's the only things that you need to know to use an API, right? It's an interface. It allows applications to talk to each other. So what you need really is a way to invoke the API and what it's going to give back to you so that you can take it and break it apart and display it in your application. Now, there's APIs for all sorts of things. The weather is probably the simplest or is the most basic and probably least controversial topic that I could pick. But many places give you APIs that you could use to create a web page. If you ever notice, like if a web page has headlines, news headlines, it could be calling an API to get those. Google Ads are probably a API that you call to put on your page. Again, anytime you want two applications to talk to each other, you can use, provided that they have defined an API for it, you can use the API in your code. Now, what do you need to do? You need to take what they have started and add some stuff to it. So what stuff do you need to add? You need to change it so it doesn't retrieve the location, but allows you to enter in a city instead. So we're going to make this a more generic weather application. The way it's written now, it retrieves your current location. We're going to allow the user to type in any city that they want to. So we're going to get rid of the code that retrieves the weather data for the current location, add a text box for city and a button, and when the user clicks the button, make the API call to retrieve the weather for the city. And then finally add the high and low to the output. Now, how do we call this? How do we make the API call to call based on a city? Well, if you look in here, API by city name, that's what you're going to want to look at. And if you click on that, that shows you what the URL needs to be. We're not going to pass the latitude and longitude. We're going to pass the city name in a variable called Q. And we're going to keep our app ID. City equals Helsinki. Oh, doesn't have Helsinki. What would be a good, let's do Orlando. Oh, no, it's not city, it's Q, my mistake. And here's the temperature in Orlando. So notice that our API call is different. for this. We're not passing latitude and longitude. We're passing the name of the city. Not passing these, we're passing this. So you'll get that from a text box on the page. You will not use geolocation. Which is nice because you shouldn't have any errors then. You shouldn't have any errors in terms of what I want to say, in terms of not having permission set, because you're not going to be using the geolocation. And then you're going to set the high and low temperature to alter it. Are there any questions out there? This may seem a little bit intimidating. Make sure you understand how it works first before you go in and try to change the code. All right, look at the API documentation to review how to call it with a city. Watch that video to get another explanation of how it works. And if you still have any questions, let me know. All right, that's all I had for today. If there are no questions, I'm going to be over online in my virtual classroom in about 10 minutes to answer any questions that you or other people may have. If not, we will see you next week.